This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the American Monetary Association's podcast, where we explore how monetary policy impacts the real lives of real people and the action steps necessary to preserve wealth and enhance one's lifestyle.
It is my pleasure to welcome one of our clients to the show. She is Elena Clark, coming to us from New York City, and she has a fascinating story. We might touch on a little bit of a client case study, but mostly I wanted to have her talk about her experience as an attorney in Russia during the privatization phase. I mean, it has always been such a mystery to me. How does a country go from communism to private ownership? And, you know, if you look way back to the philosophers hundreds of years ago, all of their great writings about private property, and really that is so inextricably tied to the idea of human rights. Because if you don't own the benefits of your labors, you have no rights. If they are owned by the state, you don't have rights. You know, that's inextricably linked together. So what Elena did is she helped figure out how assets would be distributed to people and dealt with disputes when people had disputes over assets and the state during the changeover of the former Soviet Union to privatization. So this is going to be a fascinating discussion. Elena, I'm so happy to have you on. Welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mr. Hartman. Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate your interest in my story. And definitely there is a lot to share because history repeats itself just as we speak.
Yeah.
Now.
That's a very good point. Hopefully we will not repeat that mistake.
Let's choose the best from the history to repeat itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Elena, does any of your experience in the former Soviet Union tie in with your interest in real estate in the US? I mean, you own several rental properties now. You know, you're a client of our network, and we appreciate you being a client. Do those two things tie together, your experience there versus your interest in real estate here?
Of course. My parents were free market capitalists, and they didn't know about it. So they always had a passion since they were poor Soviet people first, yes, right? But they succeeded during the period of 90s because they became entrepreneurs and they making quite good money because they provided services. So my father is a topographist.
Topography for real estate.
Topography for real estate. And they did well because topography survey was important part of the privatization process. So they were right in the beginning of that. And they established quite nice middle-class wealth. And they always invested their excess of money into the real estate.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
And this is how I became passionate about real estate and always learned as much as I possibly could. I invested in Russia and I keep investing in the United States because I think I provide with a good thing. I provide people with a place to live and I help them to maintain a good environment. Occupying property, my tenants are nice families, nice people, and they are grateful that the property, instead of being vacant, has an option to be occupied.
Right. And Elena, I just want to talk for just a second about the story of how we met, because your investment counselor introduced us because you were having a challenge with one of your properties and you got rid of your manager and you're self-managing it. And now you're a confident self-manager. I absolutely love it. Do you want to share that story a little bit?
Sure. And I was so emotional about it too, because you know how it is. One of my properties were vacant for a few months, and my previous management company, which I hired, they couldn't place a tenant, and they even lost the prospective tenant. So the reason was because they wanted to charge unnecessary fees, so like moving fees or whatever. I can't
remember. But this is why, folks, you've got to self-manage your properties. Yeah. Listen to me about this, and it's easier. So you said that before, Elena, but go ahead.
Right.
Yeah. So when you took over the management, and what happened?
When I fired them, I used Himlane, the online platform, and I found it very easy to work with them, to collaborate with them. For a kind of limited fee, they run the listings on major platforms for me, like Realtor.com
and they help you get the tenant. And,
yes, by advertising my my home, yes. And they help to run the background of the tenant, so I don't have to deal with that part. They show remotely, so they set up the log box, and the tenants first go through the identification process with the platform, and then they go to the house, get an access, and can see the house. So no one has to be present, so it saves tons of effort and time. This is how I found a qualified tenant who moved in August. Mr. Hartman, I thank you that you were guiding me through that process and helping me do right things to rent out my house quickly. I think it was completely missed by the previous management company.
Yeah. And Elena, I am just so proud of your progress. I mean, you were in a tough situation. And when Lisa introduced us, we got everything straightened out. You're a member of our Empowered Investor Pro Group, and you are now an empowered investor because you're self-managing. And I know that you commented before about how it's really just not that hard. I mean, people need to do this. It's really quite easy with the tools available to you now. So that's just great. And are you going to, I don't know if you're self-managing your other properties. Are you going to self-manage all of your properties now?
All of them besides one, because they were able to renew the lease with current tenants, so I didn't want to touch it, and they increased the rent, so it makes sense to keep them for now. But all of my other properties, yes, I do manage them, self-manage them.
So tell everybody a little bit about what you did, what your role is. Were you working in Moscow as a young attorney? And tell us about that job.
So I worked in Samara City as an attorney, and later I moved to Moscow, but I stopped my practice by then. And because I shortly moved to the United States after that. But when I lived in Samara City for many years, where I graduated from the State University civil law process, after the privatization of lands and housing in Russia in 90s, there were lots of gaps in law and lots of disputes, land and ownership related, after basically when the state-owned property transferred to the private ownership. And there were lots of disputes. And I, as a young attorney back then, helped people to fight for their rights to own their land according to the new laws.
Were most of these fights between the state and the individual, or between different individuals who were claiming rights to the property, or were they both?
Both. So, but mostly between the state and the individuals. And I represented the individuals in their disputes, in land-related disputes.
So who was actually paying you? Who did you work for?
Individuals.
Okay. So the individual would hire you. And I would imagine back then, unless they were well connected, they didn't have much money to pay you. I mean, how did that all work?
So I practiced law in 20s. So by then there were lots of problems solved, and the free market and economy kind of took over in Russia. That hard transition from Soviet Union to free market economy was kind of almost resolved. Lots of issues were resolved, and at that point people had jobs. Many people became entrepreneurs. Many people, including my parents, established very good financial base during 90s, towards the end of 90s, and they become kind of not maybe wealthy, but upper middle class people with good financials, because they worked, they used the free market economy trends, and they just provided the society with goods and services, and they succeeded.
That's fantastic.
So there were people who remained in denial, and they refused those opportunities. They remained just ignorant to new opportunities, because what we had after Soviet collapse, we had kind of mess in the society, a social crisis, because there were lots of fraud. There were new laws which were in conflict with one another. There were lots of crime, corruption, and people had a very minimal financial literacy to handle all this. So many became a victim of fraud. But once people started seeing opportunities, they took them. And that created pretty quickly, I would say, the kind of wealthy middle class, and people who had enough money. Also, very important to know that privatization of housing and land privatization was free.
What do you mean it was free? I mean, the land was free, right? And the housing was free. It was given to them by the state.
Right, exactly. So let me talk about a little background of privatization, how it started. So when Soviet collapsed in December 1990, 1991, Russian Federation was formed, and it quickly went into bankruptcy because we heard about those years, and I lived in back then in Russia, so it was complete disaster, and there were lots of corruption. So what happened? The government came up with a new reform, privatization, and there were two types of privatization. The industrial, which was seen by people as a bad privatization because it caused even more problems and more job loss for people, and even caused more financial problems for middle class in Russia.
Let's just talk about that for a moment. So you mean when a factory, for example, was privatized, now those were pretty much, as my understanding, those all went to the now oligarchs, right? So,
right.
A typical person on the street that wasn't in the sort of the cognoscente, right, the connected group, they didn't get an opportunity to own a factory, right?
Correct.
Yeah. But I'm guessing what you're alluding to here is that what would now be considered an oligarch took over that factory. They would lay people off. They would make it more efficient.
Yes. Once they owned the factory, it was easier for them to basically cash out their money and announce bankruptcy, which led to a massive job loss because those factories stopped functioning or were resold or were completely sold for other usage. So people lost lots of jobs. But there was a good privatization, which was housing and land privatization, and that was free. So during the Soviet time, there was two types of land use. So we talk about state farmed and urban organizations where people worked. So both had ownership of the housing and lands where people lived. So, for example, if we talk about state farms in villages and rural areas, so there were people who worked on those farms and they had land and they could build where they can build a house, their home. And there were two types of land use, either indefinite permanent use for lifetime or free lease or free rental agreement with the state.
And these were all farms, right?
Yeah, this is about farms. Because people also lived there on farms and they worked on the land in state farms, and state farm would own the land and just distribute the land by pieces. I think it was limited by 1,000 square meters, and people could live on that land, work on the land, growing food and running their farms with cattle, for example, and domestic birds, and live in the house which they could build.
Were they always given the farm that they happened to occupy at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse? Or were they given like a different farm? And Elena, this kind of ties into what happened way back in history in the US that you're probably familiar with, the Homestead Act, right? And there's a movie about this with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. I can't think of what it's called, but I don't know what it's called. Anyway, someone can comment below in the comments and tell me what that movie's called. It was like 30 years ago, maybe. It shows how the West was kind of settled, where you would go get a homestead and the government would just give you free land if you would go there, settle it, and start farming on it. So were they always given the farm that they just happened to occupy, or could they get a different farm? I mean, what if they liked their neighbors?
No. So the main rule was that to live and occupy the farm for more than 5 years. So everyone who would occupy the farmland, the piece of farm, which was a part of the state-owned farm, if they lived there for more than 5 years, based on two types of usage, say one was a lease for 25 years, and then later they started to issue the lease for 49 years. So that was the evidence of the person occupying farm legally during the Soviet and receiving this land legally.
That 25-year or 45-year lease, was that under the Soviet Union or after the Soviet Union?
No, under Soviet Union.
Okay. So they would actually pay rent to the Soviet government, right?
No, it was free lease. Yes, they worked. They paid for the maintenance. They built their own home. They worked in the farm. They kind of worked for collective jobs. They were assigned for collective jobs. There was a huge production controlled by central planners. So they had plan for each season, for each year, for each area in Russia, and state farms would receive that order from central planners and just make sure that it's accomplished. And everyone would just work for collective goal. However, they also had their land and they could grow their own food for themselves.
Yeah. Good stuff. Wow, that's so interesting. So, would they ever have to pay for any of this, or was this just given to them by the state? I know you said that there was like a rent-free thing, or it wasn't necessarily always given to them. It was sometimes free rent, like a long-term free lease. Tell us about that.
When privatization began, people started applying to convert their occupied land, which they occupied for more than 5 years, and they could get for free the limited amount of land, the limited size, which was in urban areas, I think it was 600 square meters.
Okay.
I don't know in feet, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, just multiply by 10, so that's 6,000 square feet.
And in the countryside, and it was something between 1,000 and 1,200 square meters.
Okay, so that's just multiply by 10 for feet, and that's 12,000 square feet at the larger end. Okay.
It's a large. So this land, the family could get for free, could privatize for free. However, of course, there were always some kind of like probably there is a land boarding to the land, to the farm, and they could probably develop it, get some additional, like, for example, there were vacant lands as well of boarding the farm, and they were allowed by privatization laws to buy extra land, boarding their land if it was vacant, if there were no disputes with the neighbors, no disputes with the state or with the state farm. So that land belonged to no one. Mm-hmm. So they had the right to buy it for nominal price. How they would determine the nominal price? So it was really undervalued compared to market price. So they charged for 20% of nominal price, and nominal price was based on market price, which it was 70% of market price. And I don't know how they determined market price, probably by comparison.
That's the question I was going to ask you because of our prior discussions. So, folks, this is really interesting. There are some fascinating videos that I have watched on YouTube over the years, and I wanted to send one to Elena, but I couldn't find the real one I wanted to send. And, think about it. It's such a foreign world to anybody listening or watching this, right? But think about this idea. If the state owns the factory that produces the shoes or the widgets or the whatever, right? How do you know what to sell it for? Because, Russian citizens had to pay for a lot of things, even under communism, right? Or Soviet citizens. It's not like everything was free. Now, some stuff was free, right? They would just give it like a ration, like our government gives away cheese, right? And welfare, I guess. But that's a different rabbit hole. But they would have to pay for some things. So how would the state ever know what to charge someone? And this goes back to my compared to what? Because the only way we know the value of anything is by comparing it to something else. And in a capitalist free market system, that's the way we know the value. Think about it. In residential real estate, we use comparison, we use comps, right, to determine the value of the house. In anything, I'm in a hotel right now, right? How did the hotel know what to charge me? Well, they have software that goes out and looks at what all their competitors are charging, and then they decide what to charge to be more competitive, hopefully than their competitors. And this is this constant game of trying to reshuffle the deck so that you win the game, right, when you're a capitalist. But how would you ever know how to price anything under communism? One of the ways they did it, they had this pricing bureau, and they had these big books, those old books, these dot matrix printer printouts with the little holes in the side from the old days that would print these big long sheets, and they were perforated, and they would go into these big giant folders with those metal fasteners. And they showed it on the video, how they knew the price of bread and the price of milk and the price of this and that. And it was just a big catalog. And literally the central planners would say, this is the price of this thing throughout this giant country with tens of millions of people. It's just crazy to think a system worked that way. Well, it didn't work very well, obviously. But yeah. So any comments on that, Elena?
Well, I'd say during the Soviet period, people were selling their land also. It wasn't like a technical purchase agreement contract. It was more like an exchange. So, but they also used a monetary basis for this to determine the price of the land. For example, one family has a better house and in a better area, and they want to, for some reasons, they maybe want to move to another area, to a different area close to their parents, and they want to exchange their house, their land, their farm for that farm in the wanted area.
So how would they do that?
There is a difference in value for sure, because one is located in a better place and maybe larger, and house maybe bigger, and another, which they want to move in, is a little cheaper because it's in more maybe farther from administrative center, maybe less developed. So for any reasons, they had always that monetary value of the land in between, and they could exchange and pay the difference.
Wow, interesting. And when they exchange their land in that example, would they find a direct person to do the trade with? Like this person wants to trade with this person, or would they put it on the market somehow and find one buyer and then convert that to money and then pay the other person money? I mean, how would that go?
This is an interesting question, and I don't know an answer. Because I didn't live in that time. I kind of grew up in 80s, 90s, so I did not catch that period of time.
Elena, one of the things I really wanted to ask you at the beginning of our discussion is, I assume what you were doing was pretty much a lawsuit, right? Yes. Was it so it was a lawsuit. So basically, you would have clients that came to you as the plaintiff suing the government to get their rights. And what I want to ask you is, first of all, which government did you sue? Did you sue, the government in Moscow, right? Or did you sue like a local government of some sort? And then what was it like working with the government? Were they like an easy defendant that would sort of roll over and just wanted to get stuff done and settle these disputes? I'm actually kind of surprised that the former Soviet Union would allow people to have much recourse at all, to redress their grievances with the government, like, they do in the US, obviously. But tell us about that.
So in spite of the good side of housing privatization, there were lots of fraud, as I mentioned in the beginning. So, for example, most of the cases that I presented, helping my clients, representing my clients, were related to the dispute between, so there was a document given to the corporation in the big, I worked in an urban area, so I didn't work in a farm area in countryside. I worked in an urban area, Samara City. So I sued the local government, not the Moscow, local government. At that point, it was run by Limansky, I believe. I'll double check. I think the mayor. So I sued the mayor. And what happened? So people had their documents, which were, they had the proof of their free rental agreement. They had the proof of their indefinite permanent use granted them during the Soviet Union time. And they lived there more than 5 years. They owned the home, a house built on it, and they took care of maintenance. They had used the land with good intentions. So when the fraud started and people who didn't transfer their land granted them during the Soviet Union into the private ownership, so they didn't register it yet, because according to to Russian law, the ownership of property is confirmed by the registration bureau. So it's only the way to confirm it after Soviet collapsed when privatization started. So they established, I think in 1995 or 1996, a registration bureau, and everyone who wanted to privatize their land or their property, also apartments, but with the land, it was more problems, of course. So I worked with the land in the urban areas. And before they transitioned from state-owned property to the private-owned property, had a process. And sometimes it could take up to 1 year. So during that time, people didn't have the certificate of private owner and registered in the registration bureau. So, and that was the room for thieves to step in. So unfortunately, we had a mayor at that time who assigned to new corporations, to like new entities, joint stock organizations, assigned the land where people basically lived. So we had a situation where sometimes those corporations would come to an area, I'd say it's like to the area where many people live, and they bring the huge, what's the word for the big machine that smashes everything on its way, and they try to clean up the area. Okay. Yes, and we faced even this.
Wow.
What happened? Yes. So what happened? So the corrupt government at that time assigned the land where people lived and had the permanent right to privatize their land to their private ownership. But the corrupt government assigned it to a corporation which wanted to get rid of people of their houses. Remember, who owns the land in Russia owns the property. Whatever is attached to the property doesn't matter.
Yeah. Right.
Even if I build the house on the land which doesn't belong to me, I don't own the house. That's Russian law. So who owns the land can do whatever they want with whatever is attached to the land, including the house. So they achieved illegally from the government, local government. So they were assigned the land where people actually lived and had the right to privatize for free. They got the document and they tried to get rid of people. We had some very sad situations. Yes, of course.
Wow.
We had some poor woman who registered the house, and she had a Soviet document for the land, but she didn't privatize it. And the corporation which achieved the document on the land under the house illegally, they burned the house to the ground.
Oh my God. Wow. One of the questions I was going to ask you is, when you did this, you were really a freedom fighter. Really, hats off to you for doing that. That's awesome. Were you concerned about your own safety and your own welfare? I mean, I would assume that they would want to put the lawyers out of business or, kill them. I mean,
I've got lots of threats. Yeah. Some of them threatened me. Yes.
Wow. Is that why you got out of it ultimately, or how did you feel about those threats at the time?
Certainly uncomfortable, but I'd say it was not my main reason why I left Samara. I left Samara because I wanted to develop myself into an entertainer. So I wanted to find my own voice, and I wanted to live overseas. So I kind of had my American dreams back then. So I wanted to turn completely to a different area. However, using my knowledge, my beliefs, my core beliefs for my all work I will do. But no, I didn't think back then that I would leave because I was threatened. I still was protected because my family had some connections. They knew those people who threatened me, and they could notice. So I kind of had a protection. Yeah,
that's just.
But I swear it was not easy. Yes, it was not.
Right. That's just thuggery, which is what, unfortunately, the U.S. seems to be declining into. Elena, what else do you want people to know? What else do you want to share with people about this? Just anything I didn't ask you. It's up to you. Tell them.
Russia was the first country with a unique history of transition from private ownership of property to the state ownership of property, state-owned status of property, and then back. And both were bloody and very harmful for people, because during the privatization and this fraud, many people lost their apartments, lost their homes, which they had right to privatize for free, but they lost them due to fraud because they were kidnapped, for example, tortured, and they had to sign the document giving the ownership to the thief, to the criminals. Wow. It was massive. So going back to my point, Russia has the unique history of transitioning from private ownership of property in the beginning last century, right? Revolution in October of 1917, and all disaster that it caused by power taken by communists. And I can go on and on about that period of time. And then Russia transitioned back to private ownership of property and free market and capitalism, and did it well. But it was very tough transition. So to your listeners, let's not let it happen here.
Wow, that's a great message.
Let it happen anywhere. It's hard. It causes lots of lives. It causes lots of drama.
No,
let's write movies for drama, but in real life, I believe in multiplying goodness versus evil. I will always fight against evil, even in my acting work, because I can transition from being a lawyer in Russia to being an entertainer in the United States.
Elena, I mean, people, especially these crazy people on college campuses nowadays, whether they be professors or students, because the students are getting the ideas from the professors, sadly, but they don't realize that communism is responsible, whether it be under Stalin or Mao or, any of the smaller ones, is responsible for the deaths of 150 to 200 million people over the last 100 years. This is important stuff. Private property rights are human rights. I mean,
Yes.
you've got to have the right to own your labor. And if you don't have that right, you really don't have any rights.
That's right. Because if the right of your private ownership of property is taken from you, what else to take from you? Your body, your freedom, your personal freedom, right?
Yep.
The next step. And we
Absolutely.
all know how it goes through the history.
Yeah, it's never worked at any time in history or any place on earth, and it's not going to work in the U.S. either. We're battling over that now. We've got a pretty serious election coming up, as we all know. Elena, did you want to give out your website or YouTube channel for your acting career? You have a notary business in New York, which is great. But whatever you want to share with people, feel free.
Sure, if I may. So I shot the film. It's like a satire about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels writing their Communism. I couldn't help it.
Very fitting. Yeah.
It's really funny. It's finishing its post-production. Actually, I'm doing a fundraising campaign as well, if you like to share, but totally fine. If not.
Please share that. Give out the websites.
All right. So my film is called Marianne and the Rebels. And we are doing fundraising campaign now on GoFundMe. And my website is ElenaClarkPerformer.com.
ElenaClarkPerformer.com. Well, Elena Clark, thank you for sharing your amazing story. Thank you for being a great client. We really wish you just incredible success with your real estate portfolio. That is just an amazing story to hear about the former Soviet Union. So we appreciate you sharing it.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.